far as I know, the following points are pretty much universal, but like with everything else in driving, they might be different where you're doing your exam, so check with your local department. Here are 5 misconceptions about the driving exam. Number 1, you have to do your parking in one single continuous move. The very vast majority of people that do driving exams are beginners, and examiners are well aware of that. They're also aware of the fact that if you had to spend enough time during your driving courses to become a pro at parking, you'd take the whole driving course only for that, which wouldn't leave a lot of time for more important things like, driving. They're not expecting you to be perfect at parking. What they want to see mainly is safety. Putting your turn signal, doing your verifications before reversing or advancing, checking properly during the whole maneuver, not being too close to other vehicles, obstacles, or other road users, and so on. Basically, you need to be safe at every step. So if you need to correct yourself, make sure that you check for all that. 2 things though. 1, you can't stay there all day correcting yourself. Examiners have other things to do, like going on the road with other candidates, going home to have dinner with their families, sleep, and so on. But if you need to take a few steps to correct yourself, there's absolutely no problem with that as long as you're safe throughout all of them. And 2, the vehicle doesn't need to be perfectly straight, but try to at least leave it as straight as possible. Sometimes they'll ask you to straighten it, and that's totally fine. And some students fail in this step because since the examiner asked them to redo something, they get nervous because they think they messed up, and they advance impulsively without checking. And sometimes there's a car approaching, a pedestrian, or whatever. Just make sure to check all around before proceeding and to be safe throughout all the maneuvers. If you don't see well, move very slowly. That way, even if you don't see other people, they'll see you and react accordingly. Like here, she probably doesn't see me, but I see her. So don't worry too much about doing the perfect parking aesthetically or parking as quickly as possible. You're a beginner and they're well aware of that. A lot of experienced drivers, even some that have been driving for decades, still have trouble with parking. There are some, however, that have some ingenious parking skills. You have to give them that. Number 2, if you make a single mistake, you fail. If that was the case, we'd all be cyclists. A driving exam works more or less like a school exam. You need a certain amount of points to pass. And that amount may vary depending on where you're doing your exam, but let's say it's 75 on 100. That means that if you make smaller mistakes, you lose points. If you lose more than 25 points, you fail. If not, and if you didn't make any critical mistake, you pass. Smaller mistakes might include things like putting your turn signals a bit early or late, stopping a bit far before or after the stop line, stopping or accelerating a bit too roughly, and so on. Basically, mistakes that don't have grave consequences. However, if you make a critical mistake, even if it's the only mistake you made during the whole exam, it's usually an automatic failure. Critical mistakes are either mistakes that create dangerous situations or situations where you'd usually get a fine in everyday life. For example, crossing a solid line, not stopping completely at a stop, not stopping at a yellow light when you had enough time to do so, not coming to a complete stop before turning right at a red light, going too fast or too slow, not respecting priorities, dangerous lane changes, hitting or almost hitting something, and so on. In those cases, the examiner usually intervenes by either grabbing the steering wheel or by braking. That's the reason why, if you bring your own vehicle, they check if your emergency brake works properly before going on the road. If it doesn't, they usually refuse the vehicle. Or it could even be a verbal intervention. For example, if you brought your own vehicle and it has a foot emergency brake, the examiner cannot access it, so they might tell you to stop. Now, it's extremely rare that a student doesn't make a single mistake though, and when you make a mistake, they'll write it down. Which brings me to the next point. Don't freak out if you see them writing down. Whether you pass or fail, they'll take notes. After the exam, they'll explain your mistakes to you and tell you what you need to improve. Even if you passed with a very high score, they'll still take notes. Then after the driving part is done, they might also ask you questions like, so, how did it go according to you? Or did you make any mistakes? Or anything along those lines. Now, this is an important step. If you do know what mistakes you made, tell them. They want to know that you're at least conscious of them, that you recognize them. So consider this step part of the exam, even if it takes place after the driving is done. Number 3, at the exam, I'll go slowly to show them that I'm safe. That's something you hear a lot from students. Go slowly, okay, but only when needed. Don't do it when it's not needed. When you go too slow, you're doing 3 things mainly. 1, you're creating road rage around you, and because of that, you're inciting other drivers to commit offenses, like overtaking dangerously. Sometimes even when you're respecting the speed limit on a street with a relatively low speed limit, people do that. Like here, where the maximum speed is 30 kilometers per hour. 2, you're wasting the examiner's time. They have other people to take on the road. And 3, you're showing them that you're hesitant, that you're not ready, that you can't go with the flow of normal traffic, and they don't want to give a license to someone who's not ready. So try to stay as close as possible to the speed limits, unless exceptional circumstances require you to go slower. And that also goes for slowness when you stop at stop signs. Don't stay there for longer than it's needed. There's this myth about stopping for 3 seconds, and some students want to stop even longer to show that they're even safer. There's no 3 seconds. The law says that you have to come to a complete stop and then proceed according to priorities. Period. So do that, make sure to do your verifications well, and don't stay any more or less time than you need to. Number 4, if I'm very skilled, I'll most surely pass the exam. Well, actually this one might be a tiny bit true. If you're more skilled, you're more in control of the vehicle. But the driving exam is a lot more about safety than it is about skill. No matter how skilled you are, there are things that are required at the exam, and you'll need to do them in order to pass. Some examples of those things: checking the blind spots before changing lanes, before turning, and before parking. Turning into the first available lane. If you change multiple lanes successively, you'll need to turn on the signal, do the verifications, change lanes, turn off the turn signal, then repeat all these steps for any successive lane change. Stopping at yellow lights when you have the time to do so, and so on. These are things that a lot of people don't do in everyday life, and that fail people at the exam no matter how skilled they are. That also goes for parking. There are sometimes students who try to impress by parking as quickly as possible. No turn signals, no verifications, no nothing. Which means no points for the parking. Remember, it's safety over quickness. So if you're very skilled, don't be overconfident. Confident, yes, not overconfident. And if you're less skilled, be confident too, because if you both do what's required, you both have the same chances of succeeding. And finally, number 5, examiners fail you on purpose. And the main argument people have here is that they want people to go back there repeatedly so that they can make more money off of them. The driving exam is a service offered by the government, not by a private business. Their purpose is to offer a service to the public, not to make money. Fees for a driving exam vary depending on where you're doing it, but they're usually around $20 to $30. When you take into account that, per person, it's more or less 30 minutes of driving, plus the briefing at the end, plus the time that the examiner gets ready for the next candidate, the whole process adds up to a little bit less than an hour. At $20 to $30 per person, there's no way they can be doing this for profit. Also, if an examiner failed everybody, their bosses would be asking questions. And if all examiners failed everybody, there wouldn't be any drivers on the roads. Now, I get comments sometimes from people saying that their examiner was in a bad mood and that destabilized them right from the start. And I can totally understand that. But first, it doesn't mean that they're in a bad mood because of you. And second, it doesn't mean they'll fail you because they're in a bad mood. We all have a bad day once in a while. And keep in mind that they themselves often have to deal with people that are hostile towards them. So they have the right to not always be 100% happy. So try not to let that throw you off. Examiners are professionals who were hired to do a job, and that's what they're doing. And your job is to be ready, drive as well as possible, and get that license. That's the only thing you should be focused on. With the next video, I'll start a series of videos about speed, panels, zones, radars, speed at the exam, how to control your speed, and so on. So stay tuned and see you soon.